For decades, the Harrington and Lancaster families had been sworn rivals in the business world. The Harringtons controlled the most prestigious luxury hotel empire, catering to the world's wealthiest elite. Their hotels were not just places of accommodation, but symbols of status and refinement. On the opposing side, Lancaster Enterprises had built a real estate empire, dominating high-end urban developments, commercial centers, and towering skyscrapers across the globe. Their rivalry was legendary. Each deal, each project, was a battlefield where neither side showed mercy. But this time, a billion-dollar opportunity had emerged. An exclusive luxury resort on a private island, a paradise designed for the ultra-rich. This project could tip the balance of power, granting absolute dominance to whichever family secured it. Yet, neither side could claim full control on their own. The Lancasters owned the island, but they lacked the expertise to develop a world-class resort. The Harringtons had unrivaled experience in managing elite hotels, but they did not own the land necessary for the project. If they continued to fight, a third party would seize the deal, leaving them both with nothing. The only viable solution? An alliance. But trust was the rarest commodity between two families locked in a generations-long feud, and only one bond could ensure absolute loyalty: a marriage between the heirs. Theodore Lancaster, the young yet ruthless CEO of Lancaster Enterprises, would marry Vivian Harrington, the only daughter of the Harrington dynasty. A marriage not for love, but for power, ambition, and the survival of both empires. Theodore Lancaster had never considered marriage, let alone one dictated by a business contract. When his father, Charles Lancaster, informed him that he was to marry Vivian Harrington, Theodore immediately resisted. "This is ridiculous. Why should I marry her?" His voice was sharp, his gaze colder than ice. But Charles remained unfazed. "If you refuse, the Harringtons will find another partner, and when that happens, you will lose control of your own company." Theodore knew his father well. This was not a threat. It was a fact. If he rejected this marriage, Lancaster Enterprises could be handed over to someone else, perhaps one of his ambitious uncles or a reckless investor. Everything he had built could disappear overnight. He despised the idea, but he had no choice. On the other side, Vivian Harrington was no luckier. When her father, Richard Harrington, announced her engagement to Theodore, she was furious. "I am not some pawn for you to trade," she snapped. But Richard's response sent a chill down her spine. "If you don't marry Theodore Lancaster, I will choose someone else. And I assure you, that man will not let you live comfortably." Vivian knew her father well. If it wasn't Theodore, it would be someone much worse, a controlling businessman, a ruthless manipulator, a marriage that would be nothing short of a prison. Between two evils, a cold but intelligent CEO like Theodore Lancaster was the lesser one. But Vivian was not a woman who accepted fate quietly. If she had to marry Theodore, she would make sure she played by her own rules. Their first meeting was nothing short of a battle. Theodore Lancaster walked into the luxurious restaurant where their families had arranged for them to meet. Sitting across from him was Vivian Harrington, poised, confident, and entirely unimpressed by his presence. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and smirked. "Joe? This is my future wife." His voice was laced with sarcasm. A spoiled little princess living off her father's wealth. Vivian didn't even blink. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. "And you?" she countered. "A workaholic robot with zero personality. I bet your life is so boring it's almost pitiful." Theodore's eyes narrowed. That was not the reaction he expected. He had assumed she would be offended, maybe even lash out in anger. But instead, she simply looked at him like he was an amusing challenge. Vivian Harrington was not easily intimidated. Their first meeting ended with neither side backing down. But whether they liked it or not, they still had a contract to sign. From the very first day Vivian stepped into Theodore Lancaster's mansion, she knew this marriage was going to be anything but easy. Not because she couldn't live with a stranger, but because Theodore deliberately ignored her existence. He was a man of ice, cold, ruthless, and disciplined to perfection. After their wedding, he made no effort to acknowledge her. No dinners together, no casual conversations, not even a glance in her direction. Vivian quickly realized a pattern. Every morning, Theodore was gone before she even woke up. Every night, he was still locked in his office when she went to bed. Even when they were in the same room, he never spoke a word. If Theodore thought she would live like a lifeless decoration in his house, he was gravely mistaken. Vivian detested boredom, and if Theodore wanted to ignore her, she would ensure he could never overlook her again. Theodore Lancaster's #1 habit: every morning he drank a cup of unsweetened black espresso. No sugar, no milk, no distractions, just pure, bitter perfection. And Vivian decided to ruin it. That morning, before Theodore entered the kitchen, she had the household staff replace every single coffee bean in the house. When he took his first sip, his brows furrowed instantly. A second later, he slammed the cup down onto the table. Vivian, his voice was ice cold. Sitting across from him, Vivian casually bit into her croissant, her tone light. "Something wrong, dear husband?" Theodore's glare could have frozen hell over. "What did you do to my coffee?" Vivian feigned surprise. "Oh, you mean the new blend? I thought we should try something healthier." His voice dropped several degrees. "What? Did you change it to almond milk latte, caffeine-free, with a hint of vanilla syrup?" She smiled sweetly. "Delicious, isn't it?" She saw his jaw clench, his fingers tighten around the cup, before he finally set it down. "Vivian," he exhaled slowly, as if trying to restrain himself. "Do you know what I hate most?" Vivian tilted her head, her expression playful. "Let me guess. Having your perfectly structured life disrupted?" Theodore stood up abruptly and stormed into the kitchen to make himself another espresso. But he didn't know that Vivian had replaced every coffee bean in the house. Exactly 10 minutes later, Theodore returned, his expression dark as a thunderstorm. "Vivian." She looked up, sipping her orange juice. "Yes, darling." He clenched his jaw so hard it could crack stone, but instead of lashing out, he simply pulled out his phone and texted his assistant. 3 minutes later, his personal barista arrived with a fresh cup of espresso from his favorite cafe. Theodore took a sip. Then, slowly, he looked at Vivian with a smug, victorious expression. Vivian simply smiled. She enjoyed this game. A spoiled heiress? Think again. Theodore Lancaster had always believed that Vivian was nothing more than a privileged heiress, a pawn in a power play between two families. He never intended to let her interfere with his business affairs. This marriage was just a contract, and he assumed Vivian would accept that, living a lavish life without ever stepping foot into his ruthless corporate world. But Vivian Harrington was not that kind of woman. When the Harrington family insisted that she be present at key business meetings, Theodore reluctantly agreed, thinking she would do nothing but sit quietly like an ornamental vase, until she proved him completely wrong. That day, the meeting was supposed to be a straightforward contract signing between Lancaster Enterprises and a major business partner. The agreement had been reviewed by both legal teams, and no one had raised any concerns, until a voice unexpectedly cut through the room. "Hold on." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Vivian. She calmly flipped through the contract, then placed it on the table, her slender finger tapping on a specific clause. According to this provision, if the subsidiary experiences financial trouble, Lancaster Enterprises will be solely responsible for covering the losses. She looked directly at the opposing firm's lawyer. "In other words, you're shifting all the financial risk onto us." A heavy silence filled the room. The lawyer on the other side hesitated for a fraction of a second. And that 1 second was all Theodore needed to realize Vivian was right. Vivian continued, her voice calm but razor sharp. "If you want to share the profits, then why should Lancaster bear all the financial risks? If you're looking for a fair partnership, we expect balanced terms. If not," she slowly closed the contract, "we'll find another partner." The executives on the other side were visibly caught off guard. Theodore, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally turned to look at Vivian. For the first time, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. She hadn't just read the contract, she had dissected it, identified a loophole, and exposed it without hesitation. In that moment, for the first time ever, Theodore Lancaster looked at Vivian Harrington with different eyes. When a heartless man starts to notice. Theodore Lancaster had always believed he didn't care about Vivian. She was just a wife on paper, a business obligation, nothing more. He reminded himself time and time again that this marriage wasn't real, that Vivian had no place in his life beyond their strategic alliance. But then he realized he was wrong. It all started at an exclusive gala event where the world's top business elites gathered to network and secure deals. Theodore had brought Vivian along, but as always, he kept his distance, maintaining his usual detached demeanor. He thought she wouldn't affect him. Until Marcus Langford entered the picture. Marcus Langford was a young billionaire, notorious for his lethal charm and his habit of pursuing the most beautiful woman in the room. That night, Marcus's eyes never strayed far from Vivian. When Theodore returned from a brief conversation with an investor, he saw Marcus leaning in, whispering something into Vivian's ear. She smiled, not the usual smirk she gave Theodore when challenging him, but a soft, genuine smile. He didn't like that. Before he even processed his actions, he had already moved forward, slipping an arm around Vivian's waist and pulling her close. Both Vivian and Marcus froze. Marcus raised an eyebrow, amused. "Theodore, perfect timing. Vivian and I were just having an interesting conversation." Theodore didn't smile. His expression was ice cold, his voice slow, sharp, and edged with warning. "She's my wife." The room fell silent. Several guests turned to watch, sensing the tension in the air. Marcus smirked, unfazed. "Oh? I was under the impression this was merely a business arrangement." Theodore's grip around Vivian's waist tightened ever so slightly. His voice dropped even lower, dangerously calm. "Don't test me, Marcus." Vivian stared at Theodore, not because he was defending her, but because of the look in his eyes. He didn't even realize he was jealous, but she did. She leaned in, her lips near his ear, her voice teasing but knowing. "Jealous, darling?" Theodore didn't answer, but he also didn't let go. Vivian smiled. At last, Theodore Lancaster could no longer ignore her. A fatal mistake. Theodore Lancaster had always been in control. In the world of business, he was known for being ruthless, calculating, and incapable of failure. But this time, he had lost. The billion-dollar Middle Eastern investment, his greatest gamble, had collapsed spectacularly. Political instability froze all funding, sending Lancaster Enterprises spiraling into crisis. Stocks plummeted, the board of directors lost faith, partners began pulling out, and Richard Lancaster, his uncle, saw his chance to strike. Using corporate politics, Richard manipulated the shareholders and rallied the board to overthrow Theodore. But the worst part? His father didn't take his side. William Lancaster, the man who had once placed all his expectations on him, now looked at him with nothing but disappointment. He was about to lose everything. But the one thing he couldn't afford to lose was Vivian. A painful decision. Theodore knew that if she stayed, she would suffer. He couldn't let her be dragged down with him. He had to let her go. That evening, when Vivian returned to the mansion, she instantly sensed something was wrong. Theodore sat on the sofa, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Are you okay?" she asked, frowning. He didn't respond. Instead, he pushed a stack of documents toward her. Divorce papers. In that moment, Vivian felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She looked up at him, disbelief written all over her face. "What is this?" Theodore's expression didn't change. "Our marriage contract has run its course. There's no need to extend it." Vivian couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything they had been through, after everything that had changed between them, this was how he ended it? "You weren't even going to talk to me about this first?" Her voice trembled with anger. "There's nothing to talk about." He leaned back, his voice void of emotion. "We were never a real couple. This was just a contract, and now it's over." "Liar." Vivian stared at him. She knew he was lying. She clenched her fists. "What if I don't sign?" Theodore set his glass down, hard. He stood, walking toward her, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you think I'd beg you to stay?" He let out a cold laugh. "Do you think I need you so much that I would hold on?" Her hands trembled, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream at him, shake him, make him see how stupid he was being. But she knew, when someone has already decided to let go, there's nothing you can do to stop them. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the pen and signed her name. Without another word, she turned and walked out. Theodore didn't stop her. He just sat there, watching the door close. He thought he would feel relieved. But all he felt was emptiness. He had just lost the one person who ever mattered. Finding a man who lost everything. Vivian Harrington had tried to forget Theodore Lancaster. But she couldn't. Not because she still loved him, but because she refused to accept how he gave up. She knew the truth. Theodore hadn't left her because he didn't love her. He left because he thought he was protecting her. But if he thought she would let him destroy himself, he was wrong. 3 months after their divorce, Vivian found Theodore in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of London. The place was nothing like the man who had once been one of the most powerful CEOs in the world. Documents were scattered everywhere. Empty whiskey glasses littered the table. A man in a wrinkled dress shirt sat on the couch, his eyes hollow, staring at nothing. Theodore Lancaster was no longer himself. When she opened the door, he didn't even notice. Not until she spoke, her voice sharp with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Theodore?" Slowly, he looked up. His eyes were empty. "Living!" He let out a dry laugh, his voice hoarse. "This is reality, Vivian. I have nothing left." Vivian clenched her fists. "You might have lost your company, your reputation, everything." Her voice was fierce, unwavering. "But you still have one thing, you idiot." She met his gaze, fire burning in her eyes. "You still have me." Not letting him sink any further, Theodore froze. No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever stayed after he lost everything. Except Vivian. She stepped forward, dropping a stack of documents onto the table. "This is a plan to rebuild. You have 2 choices." She crossed her arms. 1, stay here and drink yourself into oblivion. 2, get up, come with me, and start over. Theodore stared at the documents. She really still believed in him? She leaned in slightly, voice lower but firm. "You're not alone, Theodore. Don't be stupid and push me away again." He closed his eyes. This time, he couldn't push her away. Starting over from nothing. Vivian didn't just speak. She acted. From that day on, she pulled Theodore out of the darkness, forcing him back into the world of business. They had no grand company, no prestigious name anymore, just a small office, an old desk, and 2 chairs. No employees, no board of directors, just the 2 of them. Vivian never let him give up. She dragged him to investor meetings, convinced partners, fought beside him, just as he had fought alone for so many years. Little by little, Theodore rebuilt himself. 1 year later, Lancaster Enterprises rose from the ashes, stronger than ever. And this time, he was no longer alone. A proposal that wasn't a contract. The sunset bathed the horizon in golden hues. A soft ocean breeze carried the scent of new beginnings. Vivian leaned against the balcony, gazing into the distance, unaware that Theodore was walking toward her. He took a deep breath, a small velvet box clutched in his hand. Then he knelt down. "Vivian." She turned and froze. Her breath hitched at the sight of the diamond ring in his hand. Her heart pounded. Theodore met her gaze, his voice steady, devoid of hesitation. "I once told you I would never love you." He let out a small husky laugh. "But you made me break every promise I ever made to myself." Vivian bit her lip, fighting back tears. "And losing." Theodore tightened his grip on the ring, his eyes filled with nothing but sincerity. "I don't want a marriage built on contracts." His voice was strong. "No conditions, no negotiations, no strategic alliances. I only want one thing, a life with you. A single tear rolled down Vivian's cheek. He inhaled deeply, holding onto her hand. "This time, will you marry me?" His voice softened. "Not for our families, not for business, just because you want to." Vivian stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. The brightest smile he had ever seen. Placing her hand over his, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I changed my mind." Her lips curled. "Being your wife doesn't sound so bad after all." Theodore chuckled, pulling her into his arms, kissing her deeply under the setting sun. This time, it wasn't a transaction. It was real love.